A woman hugs her son in 1931, but zooming in on the boy's face, something feels off. Dr. Margaret Chen adjusted her reading glasses as she carefully examined the old photograph that had arrived at the Smithsonian's archives that morning. The black and white image dated 1931 captured a tender moment. A woman in a simple cotton dress embracing a young boy of perhaps 8 years old. They stood in front of what appeared to be a modest farmhouse somewhere in rural Kansas. Based on the flat horizon and the wooden fence visible in the background, it looked like just another Depression family photo, Margaret murmured to herself, noting the woman's worn shoes and the boy's patched clothing, which told the story of those difficult times. The photograph had been donated by the estate of Eleanor Hartwell, along with dozens of other family items from the early 20th century. Dr. Margaret reached for her magnifying glass to examine the photograph's condition for archival purposes. Something made her pause. The woman's face showed genuine maternal love, her arms wrapped protectively around the child. Her expression was soft and caring, exactly what one would expect from a mother holding a son. The boy, however, was different. Margaret leaned closer, her breath catching slightly. While the woman gazed down at the child with unmistakable affection, the boy's eyes seemed to stare straight ahead with an intensity that felt unsettling for someone so young. His small hands, which should have been relaxed in his mother's embrace, appeared rigid at his sides. "That is odd," she whispered, adjusting the desk lamp for better lighting. The more she studied the boy's face, the more uncomfortable she became. There was something in his expression, not the innocent wonder of childhood, but something else entirely, something far too mature and calculated for an 8-year-old child. Margaret made a note in her research log, "Unusual family photograph, recommend further investigation into the Hartwell family history." She had no way of knowing that this single photograph would unravel a mystery hidden for more than 90 years, changing everything she thought she knew about the power of a mother's love and the secrets families keep buried in plain sight. 3 days later, Margaret found herself driving through the winding roads of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, toward the large Victorian house that had belonged to Eleanor Hartwell. The elderly woman had passed away at 97, leaving behind a very organized estate and a reputation in the small town of Millfield as someone who had lived quietly but purposefully. Eleanor's great-niece, Sarah Morrison, met Margaret at the front door. Sarah was a woman in her 42nd, with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back into a practical ponytail. She worked as a librarian in Philadelphia, but had taken time off to manage her great-aunt's affairs. "I'm so glad someone from the Smithsonian is interested in Aunt Eleanor's collection," Sarah said as she led Margaret through rooms filled with carefully preserved furniture and photographs. She was passionate about family history, though she was always quite private about certain aspects of our family's past. The house felt like stepping back in time. Hardwood floors creaked beneath their feet as they passed walls lined with family portraits spanning several generations. Margaret noticed that many of the photographs were professionally mounted and labeled with Eleanor's neat handwriting. She never married or had children of her own, Sarah explained, but she devoted her life to preserving our family's story. She used to say that photographs were windows into souls and that they revealed truths people might prefer to keep hidden. They reached Eleanor's study, a cozy room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a large oak desk covered with magnifying glasses, photo albums, and research notes. Sarah picked up a leather-bound journal from the desk. "This might interest you," she said, handing it to Margaret. "These are Aunt Eleanor's research notes about the 1931 photograph you mentioned on the phone. She spent years trying to understand that particular image." Margaret opened the journal carefully. Eleanor's handwriting filled the pages with dates, observations, and questions. One entry immediately caught her attention, the boy in mother's arms. Why do his eyes hold such darkness? What did he know that we never understood? The truth about Thomas must be somewhere in the photographs. Thomas? Margaret looked up at Sarah. Who was Thomas? Sarah's expression grew troubled. "That is just it. We are not entirely sure." Later, Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee from an old percolator in the kitchen, while Margaret spread several photographs across the wooden table. The afternoon sun streamed through lace curtains, casting intricate shadows across the images. "What I am about to tell you might sound strange," Sarah began, settling into her chair. Growing up, I heard whispered conversations among the older family members about a boy named Thomas who lived with my great-grandmother, Ruth Hartwell, in the early 1930s, but the stories never quite matched up. She pointed to the 1931 photograph that had started Margaret's investigation. Some relatives insisted this was Ruth's son, Thomas, who died young of influenza. Others claimed he was not her biological son at all, but a child she was caring for temporarily. A few family members even suggested that Thomas never existed, that the photograph showed a different child entirely. Margaret studied the image again, noting the boy's peculiar expression. What did Eleanor believe? That is what makes this so intriguing, Sarah replied, pulling another photograph from a large envelope. Aunt Eleanor found this last year while going through some papers in the attic. The second photograph, also from 1931, but taken several months later, based on the seasonal clothing, showed the same woman, Ruth Hartwell, standing alone in front of the farmhouse. She appeared tired, almost haunted, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Most notably, there was no sign of the boy. "Look at the back," Sarah urged. Margaret carefully turned the photograph over. In faded ink, someone had written, "After Thomas left us." May God forgive what we allowed to happen. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Left? But your family members said he died of influenza. Exactly, Sarah said grimly. That is when Aunt Eleanor realized her family had been keeping secrets for nearly a century. She became obsessed with finding out the truth about Thomas, who he really was, where he came from, and most importantly, what happened to him. Margaret pulled out her notebook. Did Eleanor discover anything else? Sarah hesitated before reaching for a third photograph. She found this hidden behind the frame of an old mirror in the attic. It is dated 2 weeks before the first photograph was taken. This image showed Ruth Hartwell with a completely different boy, one with lighter hair and a genuine smile. The resemblance between Ruth and this second child was unmistakable. This, Sarah said quietly, was Ruth's actual son, James. He died of pneumonia in early 1931, just days after this photograph was taken. Margaret returned to Washington, D.C. with copies of all 3 photographs and Eleanor's research notes, her mind racing with questions. The next morning, E reached out to Dr. James Patterson, a colleague who specialized in checking photos and historical documents. I need you to examine these images very carefully, she told James as they met in his laboratory. I want to know everything, the paper, the chemicals used in developing them, and any signs of tampering. James was a careful researcher who had helped solve several historical mysteries. He placed the first photograph under a high-powered digital microscope connected to a computer monitor. Interesting, he murmured after several minutes. The photograph is definitely authentic. The paper and chemicals are consistent with 1931 techniques, but there is something unusual about the image quality. Margaret leaned closer. What do you mean? See this area around the boy's face? James pointed to the screen. The grain structure is slightly different. It is subtle, but it suggests this part of the photograph may have been subject to some kind of extra processing. He switched to the second photograph of Ruth standing alone. This image shows no such problems. It is a straightforward photograph taken with standard equipment of that time. But when James examined the third photograph of Ruth with her biological son James, he made a discovery that changed everything. Margaret, you need to see this, he said, his voice filled with excitement. He overlaid the 2 images on his computer screen, adjusting for slight differences in position and lighting. Look at the background elements, the fenk, posts, the shadows, the position of the farmhouse. Margaret stared at the screen. The backgrounds were nearly identical, suggesting the photographs had been taken from almost exactly the same spot. But more importantly, James continued, look at this. He zoomed in on Ruth's dress in both photographs. See this small tear in the fabric near her left shoulder? It is visible in both images. And here, this scuff mark on her shoe. These photographs were taken much closer together in time than the dates suggest. Margaret felt her heart race. What are you saying? I am saying that based on the physical evidence, these photographs were likely taken on the same day, possibly within hours of each other. With this new information, Margaret decided to travel to Millfield, Kansas, where the Hartwell family had lived in 1931. The small farming community, now with fewer than 2,000 people, still kept records from the Depression era in its town hall. Mary Kowalski, the town clerk, was a woman in her 72nd who had lived in Millfield her entire life. Her grandfather had been the town's doctor during the 1930s, and she knew a lot about local families. Ruth Hartwell, Mary said thoughtfully as she pulled out several dusty record books. Oh yes, I remember the stories about her. My grandfather delivered her son James in 1923. Sweet boy but sickly from birth. He died of pneumonia in the winter of 1931. It broke poor Ruth's heart. Margaret showed Mary the photographs. The elderly woman studied them carefully, her expression growing increasingly puzzled. This is definitely Ruth, she said, pointing to the woman in the images. And this boy, she added, indicating the photograph of Ruth with James, looks just like the Hartwell family. James had the same sandy hair and gentle expression as his father. But when Mary looked at the photograph of Ruth with the dark-haired boy, the image that had started the investigation, her face grew troubled. This child, she said slowly, I do not recognize him at all, and I knew every family in this area during the Depression. We all looked out for each other's children. She paused, studying the boy's face more intently. There is something about his eyes that is quite unsettling, almost like he is much older than he appears. Mary walked to a filing cabinet and retrieved a folder marked 1931 birth and death records. James Hartwell died on February 15, 1931, she confirmed. But here is what is strange. There is no record of any other child living with Ruth that year. No adoption papers, no custody arrangements, nothing. She looked up at Margaret with concern. According to our official records, after James died, Ruth Hartwell lived alone on that farm until she moved to Pennsylvania in late 1931. Yet, you are showing me photographs that suggest otherwise. Margaret felt a chill. Is there anyone else in town who might remember those days? Mary thought for a moment. Frank Morrison, he is 94 now and lives at the assisted living facility. His family owned the farm next to the Hartwells. If anyone would remember a strange boy living with Ruth, it would be Frank. The Millfield Assisted Living Center was a modest, well-maintained facility. Frank Morrison sat in his wheelchair by a large window, his mind still sharp despite his age. When Margaret showed him the photographs, his reaction was immediate. "Dear God," he whispered, his hands trembling slightly as he held the image of Ruth with the dark-haired boy. "I never thought I would see that child's face again." Margaret pulled up a chair beside him. "You remember this boy?" Frank nodded slowly. "Thomas. That is what Ruth called him, though I always suspected that was not his real name. He appeared at Ruth's farm shortly after young James died, maybe a week or two later. Ruth was nearly mad with grief, and suddenly there was this boy. Where did he come from?" "That is just it. Nobody knew for certain. Ruth claimed she was caring for him temporarily, that his family was going through hard times. But the boy," Frank paused, his eyes distant with memory. "There was something deeply wrong with that child." Frank described how Thomas rarely spoke, but when he did, his words seemed far too sophisticated for his age. The boy would stare at people with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable, and he seemed to know things he should not, details about neighbors' private lives and events that happened before he arrived. "The animals did not like him," Frank continued. "My family's dog would whimper and eyed whenever Thomas was around. Even Ruth's old milk cow would become upset when he approached. Animals sense things, you know." Margaret showed Frank the photograph of Ruth standing alone. "What happened to Thomas?" Frank's expression grew dark. "He disappeared one night in late summer 1931. Ruth never spoke of it, but the next morning she was different, relieved, but also haunted. She moved away within a few months. Did anyone report him missing?" "That is the strangest part," Frank said. "Nobody seemed to care that he was gone. It was as if the entire town decided to forget he had ever existed. Even Ruth acted as though he had never been there at all." Frank leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I will tell you something I have never told another living soul. 3 days after Thomas disappeared, I was walking past Ruth's farm, and I saw her in the backyard digging. She was digging deep into the ground behind the barn, working through the night by lantern light. Margaret contacted Sarah Morrison immediately after her conversation with Frank. Together, they drove to Kansas to find the original Hartwell farm. It had been abandoned since the 1950s, but still stood on land owned by a local corporation. The current landowner, Robert Jensen, was a practical man who had grown up hearing stories about the cursed Hartwell place. He gave them permission to explore the property and even provided ground-penetrating radar equipment. The farmhouse was in ruins, its roof had collar, said years ago, but the stone foundation remained. The old barn Frank mentioned still stood, though its red paint had faded to brown. Margaret and Sarah spent the morning walking the property. Despite the decay, they were able to find the exact spot where Ruth had posed with both boys. Frank said Ruth was digging behind the barn, Margaret reminded Sarah. The area behind the barn was overgrown with tall grass, but the radar would be able to detect any disturbances in the soil. Robert Jensen arrived with his equipment around noon. "There," Robert said suddenly, stopping the machine. "Something is definitely buried here. It looks like it is about 4 feet down, in a rectangular shape." Margaret felt her heart race. "How big?" Robert studied the screen. About the size of a large suitcase. He paused, looking uncomfortable. "It could be a small casket." Sarah gripped Margaret's arm. "You do not think? There is only one way to find out," Margaret replied grimly. "We need to call the local sheriff's department. If there is any possibility that human remains are buried here, this needs to be handled properly." As they waited for the authorities, Margaret could not shake the feeling that they were about to uncover a truth the town had been trying to forget for 90 years. The wind whistled through the broken windows of the farmhouse. Sheriff David Martinez arrived within an hour with the county coroner and a forensic team. As a veteran officer, Martinez had seen many unusual cases, but a 90-year-old crime scene was new for him. "We need to be extremely careful here," Dr. Linda Chen, the forensic expert, explained. "If there are human remains, they will be fragile." The excavation began slowly, with the team removing layers of soil by hand. After 2 hours of careful digging, one of the technicians called out, "I've got something." Dr. Chen knelt down and used a soft brush to clear dirt from what appeared to be the corner of something wooden. As more soil was removed, the outline of a small handmade wooden box became visible. It was roughly the size of a child's coffin, but clearly made by amateur hands. "This was not made by a professional," Dr. Chen observed, noting the uneven joints. "Someone built this quickly." Sheriff Martinez documented everything with photos as the box was carefully lifted from the ground. It was secured with a simple latch, weathered, but still intact. "Before we open this, I want everyone to understand the gravity of what we might find," the sheriff announced. "If these are human remains, we are looking at evidence of a crime from 1931. Dr. Chen carefully opened the latch. Inside the box, wrapped in a white cloth that was now stained brown, were the remains of a small human skeleton. But as she moved the cloth aside, her expression changed to confusion. "This is unusual," she said. "These bones show evidence of abnormal development. The skull structure suggests this person was much older than the size would indicate, possibly an adult with severe development. Tal problems." She paused, studying the remains more carefully. "What?" Sheriff Martinez asked. "I have never seen anything quite like this," Dr. Chen replied. "The bone density suggests someone who was much older than their physical size. And look at this," she pointed to the skull. "The dental structure is completely wrong for a child. The teeth were adult teeth set in a skull that appeared to belong to someone much younger." While the team continued their work, Margaret received a call from James Patterson. His investigation into the photographs had produced a breakthrough. "Margaret, I have been researching medical conditions that might explain what you found," James said. "Based on your description, I think we might be dealing with a case of progeria or a similar aging syndrome." Margaret was unfamiliar with the condition. James explained that progeria was an extremely rare genetic disorder that caused rapid aging in children, often making a child look like an elderly person. In 1931, medical understanding of this was almost non-existent. "But here is what is really interesting," James continued. "I found records of a medical study from 1930 involving a child named Timothy Walsh who disappeared from a state facility in Nebraska. The boy suffered from advanced progeria and had behavioral issues." Margaret felt the pieces fitting together. "What kind of issues?" According to the records, Timothy seemed to have the mind of an adult trapped in a child's failing body. He was described as manipulative and capable of understanding adult emotions in ways that seemed supernatural to people in the 1930s. The implications were staggering. Margaret realized that what Ruth Hartwell had experienced was not supernatural, but a tragic encounter with a very sick child. "James, can you send me those records?" Margaret asked. "I think Timothy Walsh and the boy known as Thomas are the same person." After hanging up, Margaret shared the information with Sarah. The revelation changed everything. Ruth Hartwell had not been dealing with something otherworldly, but with a profoundly ill child. So Thomas, or Timothy, died of his condition while staying with Ruth, Sarah asked. "It seems likely," Margaret replied. "Ruth was probably caring for him out of compassion, but when he died, she panicked." In 1931, people did not understand progeria. If authorities had found his body, they might have suspected Ruth of harming him or believed something unnatural had happened. Margaret paused, looking at the excavation site. Ruth buried him in secret to protect herself, but also to give him a proper burial he probably never would have received otherwise. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in Eleanor Hartwell's study with Sarah. They had spent days piecing together the story from medical records and town documents. The mystery that began with one unsettling photograph had revealed a deeply human story of compassion and tragedy. The forensic analysis confirmed their theory. The remains belonged to a child about 10 years old, but with the bone and tooth development of someone much older. DNA testing compared with the Walsh family in Nebraska strongly suggested that Thomas was indeed Timothy Walsh. "Eleanor suspected the truth," Sarah said, reading from her great-aunt's final notes. "Look at this entry. Ruth saved that poor boy from a lifetime of horror in an institution. When his suffering ended, she gave him the burial he deserved, even at great risk to herself." Margaret arranged for Timothy Walsh to be buried in the Millfield Cemetery with a proper headstone. The inscription read, "Timothy Walsh, 1920 to 1931, a child who knew too much suffering, finally at peace." The 1931 photograph now made perfect sense. Ruth's maternal love had been real. She had been caring for a very sick child who had nowhere else to go. Timothy's unsettling expression was not evil, but a reflection of the pain of a child trapped in a rapidly aging body. Ruth was a hero, Margaret concluded, looking at the photograph one last time. In an era when people would have been terrified of Timothy's condition, she saw past his appearance to the suffering child underneath. She gave him comfort and dignity. The story revealed something beautiful about human kindness, while also showing how fear of the unknown can force good people into difficult situations. Ruth Hartwell had carried the secret of her kindness for decades. Margaret carefully placed the photograph into a protective sleeve. It would be donated to the Smithsonian. It would be displayed now not as a mystery, but as a testament to the power of kindness. The boy's face no longer seemed unsettling to Margaret. Instead, she saw what Ruth had seen, a child who needed love and care. In the end, the photograph had revealed its truth. Sometimes what feels off is simply something we do not yet understand.